The bodies didn't scream. They whispered. In the autumn of 1823, a wind moved through Millbrook, Pennsylvania, colder than usual, like it was carrying secrets in its teeth. Behind the ivy-covered walls of the Hartwell funeral parlor, death wasn't just mourned. It was manufactured. Every coffin, every tear, every lowered body, rituals designed to hide a grotesque truth. The townspeople thought they were burying their loved ones with dignity, but what they were really doing was feeding a machine. For 22 years, the Hartwell family ran the only funeral home for miles. They attended church, they kissed babies, they donated to widows, but in the shadows beneath their home was a cold room soaked in blood and precision, and when a traveling state physician requested to examine 3 of their patients, something snapped. He noticed the bruises first, faint rings around the neck, then a white powder, arsenic, around the lips of a young mother, organs stored like trophies in glass jars, and a leather-bound journal with names, methods, measurements. This wasn't care for the dead. This was consumption, calculation, control. Welcome to Millbrook, Pennsylvania, where death had an address. And the family that welcomed you at the door, they were already planning your burial. Dr. Samuel Harrison had seen death before. Cholera-stricken towns, malaria-ridden ports. But what he saw in the Hartwell basement wasn't disease, it was design. Rows of surgical tools too precise for mere embalming, chemical vials labeled in careful script, belladonna, arsenic, hemlock, chloroform, and worst of all, a glass tank holding what appeared to be a human heart, still pink with life. Josiah Hartwell, the eldest son, had stood nearby with a practiced smile. For study, he said, to understand the nature of illness. But there was no curiosity in his voice, only hunger. Dr. Harrison's gut twisted as he flipped through the first few pages of the hidden journal. Names, symptoms, reactions, a ledger of human experiments disguised as medical concern, each entry dated, each death recorded not as a tragedy, but a test. The most chilling note was scribbled beside a young girl's name. Reaction delayed, adjust dosage, eyes stayed open too long. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about something older, something darker, the power to hold life and death in your hand and twist it. Millbrook thought it trusted the Hartwells, but it had trusted the knife, and now the knife was keeping notes. There are places in every house where the light doesn't reach, but in the Hartwell home, the basement wasn't a neglected corner, it was a shrine. 3 steps beyond the embalming table stood a false wall. Behind it, a corridor chiseled into the foundation. Stone shelves lined with anatomy books, surgical sketches, and organs preserved in thick amber fluid. The air was colder there, not just because of the stone, but because something ancient lingered, something that watched. At the far end was a table bolted to the floor, leather restraints, a drain beneath, and on the wall a scripture, handwritten in a blend of English and Latin, in mortuis, in venemus veritatem. In the dead, we find truth. Ezekiel Hartwell, the patriarch, had built more than a funeral home. He had built a sanctum of control. He believed death wasn't an end, it was a doorway, and with the right tools, the right formula, the right sacrifice, one could walk through it. This wasn't just murder, this was ritualized erasure, a methodical unmaking of the human form to study what remained, if anything, on the other side. The community buried their dead, but in this basement, the Hartwells resurrected their purpose. In most families, children inherit heirlooms, watches, recipes, land. In the Hartwell household, they inherited death. Josiah, the eldest, had mastered the scalpel by 17. Caleb learned pressure points and ligature marks before he learned to shave. And Rebecca, the youngest, barely 19, wasn't innocent. She was precise. She tracked grief like a predator, marking which neighbors cried too long, who lived alone, who wouldn't be missed. They weren't victims of their environment. They were groomed. At dinner, the family would discuss decomposition the way others might discuss rainfall, which poisons worked quickest, how long a corpse took to stiffen in winter, which lies grieving families believed most easily. Their grandfather, Thomas Creed, once overheard Rebecca calmly suggest, "The old butcher on Miller Street has no wife. I saw him coughing yesterday." She didn't say it like she cared. She said it like she was scheduling a delivery. What makes evil so effective is when it hides behind sweetness. Rebecca braided her hair, she baked pies, she held infants at church. But behind her smile was an observer, measuring, waiting, cataloguing. The Hartwell children didn't lose their innocence. They were trained to extinguish yours. Tucked beneath burial linens, behind a cracked wall panel in the Hartwell parlor, was a second journal, this one older, dirt-stained, and written in a tighter, more mechanical hand. It wasn't a diary, it was a ledger, a record of the forgotten. Names, ages, ailments, social status, assets. Each victim catalogued like livestock. Some entries had crosses marked beside them. These were the clean deaths. Elderly, poor, no family. Others bore red circles, unstable cases. Accidental discoveries, risky experiments. One was labeled with only 3 letters, BTC. Below a note, too loud, too fast, disposed in creek, recovered ring, Val, U12. This wasn't just about murder. It was selection, curation, a private culling. The Hartwells didn't kill randomly. They harvested strategically. They studied weakness the way farmers study weather, observing who struggled, who broke, who no one would come looking for, and they perfected it over 2 decades, becoming predators dressed as caretakers. Inside that ledger were over 40 names, 40 human souls, reduced to outcomes and profits. You see, the community wasn't mourning its dead, it was feeding its executioners. And all the while, the Hartwells smiled, as if grief had always been their business. Most people fear death, but the Hartwells, they rehearsed it. Ezekiel called it the great performance. Every funeral was a stage, every corpse a prop, and the grieving, an audience sedated by ritual. He believed the trick to power wasn't in brute force, it was in convincing people to participate in their own deception. The funeral parlor was built for illusion, soft lighting to hide bruises, lavender to mask rot, and words, soothing, practiced, empty, to keep suspicion asleep. Josiah would clasp hands and whisper, "They're at peace now." Meanwhile, Caleb scrubbed blood from the stone table below. It wasn't enough to kill. You had to own the narrative. That's why the family discouraged autopsies, why they offered free services to the poor, why they insisted on same-day burials, not from compassion, control. You don't just dispose of bodies, you erase evidence, you manage perception. Every coffin lowered was a curtain drop, every mourner hugged was a silenced witness, every flower left behind was another layer of misdirection. And while the town wept, the Hartwells counted. Not souls, not sins, only silence, and how long it took for a body to cool. Martha Hartwell wore the face of mercy. She was the widow's comfort, the grieving child's warm embrace, the voice that said, "Let me take care of everything." But under her apron, tucked in the folds of flour-dusted fabric, she carried poison, arsenic, belladonna, foxglove, sometimes steeped in tea, sometimes mixed into jam, always delivered with a smile. She didn't need to kill with force, she killed with familiarity. It started subtly, a neighbor's joint pain, a cough, a fainting spell. "Here, take this soup," she'd say. "It helped my father." And by morning, the illness had worsened. By day 3, the body was cold, and the Hartwells, of course, were ready to help with the burial. no charge. She targeted the lonely, the frail, those no one would defend. Martha wasn't just a poisoner, she was a strategist. Her concoctions were tailored, enough to confuse doctors, never enough to raise alarms. And her reputation as the town's most generous woman, that was the mask she wore to move freely through the shadows. But behind her eyes there was calculation, and behind her gentle voice, a war drum. She didn't feed the hungry, she hunted them, one spoonful at a time. The screams were faint, muffled by stone, buried beneath hymns, lost in the rhythm of the funeral drums. But they were real, and they came from the cellar beneath the Hartwell home, not the embalming room, deeper, behind a door hidden beneath crates of candle wax and burlap sacks. What they found didn't belong to this world. 6 small beds, a rusted feeding pail, scratches on brick walls where tiny hands had tried to climb, bones, so many bones, not buried, not honored, just discarded like scraps. These weren't just victims, they were captives. Children, stolen from nearby counties, orphans no one claimed. Unruly boys dropped off by tired mothers, girls labelled troubled by parish priests, promised she, later given chains. The Hartwells didn't just experiment with death, they studied how to manipulate life. Fear, obedience, silence. They tested limits, pushed thresholds, broke minds. One journal entry, penned in Ezekiel's hand, read, "Subject number 4 finally stopped screaming after 72 hours. Cold, darkness, isolation, a breakthrough. The human spirit bends before it breaks. This one bent beautifully. This wasn't a funeral home. It was a lab, a tomb, a factory of silence." And the town, it kept paying for the Hartwell services, never wondering why the children never cried. Every Sunday, the Hartwells sat in the front pew, clean, composed, unblinking. Ezekiel with his hymn book open, but never singing. Martha with folded hands and a veil over her cold smile. Behind them, their sons, and behind the sons, the voices. The townspeople called it the Hollow Choir. A small group of pale-faced children, always the same number, always expressionless. They sang hymns in perfect harmony, but never blinked, never fidgeted, never looked at the congregation. Some swore they never even breathed between verses. They're orphans, Martha once explained, taken in by the Lord's will. But others whispered different things, that they'd seen one of the boys with stitches behind his ear, that a girl in the choir had identical scars to a child who went missing a year earlier, that the singing didn't sound like children at all, but like something else pretending to be. Some said the voices echoed strangely, like they came from a deep, empty room. Then there were the hymns themselves, obscure, unholy, verses that spoke of reversal, resurrection, and something called the Great Trade. Words no preacher recognized. Whatever they weren't singing to God. They were singing to something else. And the Hartwells were listening. Tucked beneath a loose plank behind the embalming table, the sheriff's men found a book bound in human skin. Real skin. Stretched tight, sewn with wire, and etched with names, not of the living, but the dead. Every name dated, every death labeled, not with cause, but with purpose. Thomas Eddings, voice extraction successful. Rebecca Lang, failed obedience conditioning. Infant number 7, bone density ideal for carving. Subject 19, soul did not return. Try older host next time. It wasn't a ledger, it was a manual. The Hartwells weren't just collecting bodies, they were harvesting properties, testing how the spirit left the flesh, measuring how long a soul lingered, documenting which parts could carry memory, which could absorb fear, which could be reused. Some entries ended with cryptic codes. SH3R, reclaimed. Enveil successful. Return by 11th hour, voice fades. But the final page was blank, except for one line, written in red. Death is a door. We learned how to knock. Soon, we'll learn how to answer. This wasn't madness. It was method. It wasn't greed. It was doctrine. And the dead weren't just buried in that funeral home. They were catalogued, repurposed, and prepared. By the winter of 1829, strange reports began surfacing from neighboring counties. A child seen wandering through snow-covered fields barefoot. Always the same face, same black eyes, same silence. Appearing before deaths, vanishing before sunrise. The townsfolk whispered of Subject 11. She'd been one of the early disappearances, a mute girl from a Catholic orphanage 2 counties over, vanished after being adopted by a tall man with silver buttons on his coat. No one saw her again, until she returned, but not as a girl. Witnesses claimed she moved like a puppet, stiff, unnatural. One farmer described her as empty but watching. Another said he followed her footprints in the snow. They stopped mid-path. Just stopped. No body, no struggle, no weight in the steps, as if she'd never been real. Back in Hartwell's cellar, her name had been circled. The margin beside it read, Subject 11, Soul Displacement Test, transferred to air sound. Results, intermittent reappearance near death zones. Target responds to death before it arrives. They didn't just kill her, they unbound her, turned her into a warning signal, a harbinger, a living echo that walked ahead of death. And she was still walking. The Hartwell's basement had always been forbidden, even to staff. But beneath the stone furnace where the bodies were prepared, beneath the creaking floorboards soaked with embalming fluids, was a hatch no one was meant to find. And beneath that hatch, a chamber carved directly into the earth. No light, no air, no cross, just a circle of chairs, 12 made of bone. At the center, a stone table etched with carvings older than English, and on that table, 13 wax figures, each made with hair and blood from real victims. They weren't dolls, they were anchors. Each figure was connected to a name in the ledger, and beside them, jars, filled with teeth, tongues, fingers, everything they'd need if reconstitution succeeded. But most chilling of all, the audio tubes. Thin brass pipes ran from the center of the table into the upstairs walls, into the funeral home itself. Anyone who stood in the parlor, anyone who wept at a coffin, was unknowingly standing within the ritual. Their grief, their words, their pain, it all flowed down those tubes, down into the chamber, feeding something ancient. Not a resurrection chamber, a resonance chamber. The Hartwells weren't just burying the dead, they were tuning them. The sheriff's men counted the chairs again and again, 12 seats carved from femurs and vertebrae, arranged in a perfect circle. But there was a space left open, dust disturbed, an outline in the soil, a place where a 13th chair once sat. And when they returned the next morning to document it, that empty space was no longer empty. A new chair had appeared, not old, not bone, but fresh, dripping, as if it had been grown, not built. Worse, embedded into the center of the seat was a still beating heart, not preserved, not embalmed, alive, thumping slow, as though waiting for its owner to return. Pinned beside it, a funeral card. Name: Jonathan C. Hartwell. Date of death: left blank. The last Hartwell was still alive. But the chair had already accepted him. One deputy leaned too close. His ears began to bleed. He screamed he heard children crying from inside his lungs, said something was whispering in the back of his mouth, begging to be let out. The chair wasn't furniture. It was an invitation, and Jonathan had already started answering it. Hidden behind a false panel in the Hartwell study, inside a locked iron box bound with rosary wire, was a handwritten manuscript nearly 300 pages long. No title on the cover, just a symbol, a circle within a square, pierced by 12 nails. The contents: a doctrine, the Hartwell resurrection doctrine. It was not about bringing people back. It was about replacing them. The core belief was simple, blasphemous, and terrifying. A soul is not one entity, it is a frequency. If you find its match, you can echo it into something else. They didn't need the whole body, just a part, hair, nail, tooth. The rest could be molded with pain, ritual, and grief. Each victim had been carefully selected to match one of the 12 resonance types the Hartwells had documented, coded by bloodline, behavior, and birth position. Twins, bastards, orphans, firstborn sons, each had a frequency. When the correct vessel was prepared and grief harvested from the families, the ritual began. But the 13th, that chair, that was the Hartwells' final goal, to echo themselves. Not immortality, multiplication. The funeral home wasn't for death, it was for duplication. July 9th, 1820. The night every clock in Millfield stopped at 2:13 a.m. The air was thick, like syrup. Livestock screamed and ran into rivers, windows cracked, infants wouldn't stop crying, even the ones born deaf. And inside the Hartwell funeral home, 13 figures sat in the chamber. Not mannequins, not corpses. Echoes. 12 of them wore the faces of the dead. Grieving mothers swore their children had come back. But their eyes were wrong, flat, reflective. No soul behind them, only memory. And the 13th? It looked like Jonathan C. Hartwell. But it wasn't Jonathan. Not exactly. What returned had his voice, his skin, his smile. But it knew things Jonathan couldn't. Ancient languages, hidden rituals, the last thoughts of every soul buried beneath the home. He called himself Thrice Hartwell, and he wasn't alone. The town records stopped that night, pages torn, maps redrawn. Even the census omitted Millfield for the next 2 decades. No one could explain why. But travelers who passed through during those lost years spoke of a town too quiet, too clean, too obedient, as if every resident had the same father and the same soul. The Hartwells hadn't failed. They had succeeded. Beneath the Hartwell funeral home, past the false floor, the blood-stained ledger, and the wall of children's shoes, lies a chamber not found on any blueprint. It is not made of wood, not stone. It pulses. The walls are veined like flesh. The ceiling breathes, and at its center is a tree, not dead, not living. Its trunk is carved with names, hundreds, thousands, some scratched in violently, others grown into the bark like tumors. At its base, a tangle of 13 coffins. But here's the horror. They're not for the dead. They're for the living. Each coffin fits perfectly to a body still above ground. One for you, one for me, one for every echo yet to be made. The Hartwells didn't vanish. They expanded. And when the 13th ritual was completed, the roots of that tree began pushing outward, through soil, through bone, through time. People across the country began dreaming of rooms they'd never entered, waking up with mud under their nails, hearing whispers from behind mirrors saying, "Come home, your echo is ready." This wasn't a family. It was a seed, and now it's growing again. If you made it this far, comment below. I am not my echo.